This inhuman event saw African being treated like property to be bought and sold. After Portugal and Great Britain, France was the third most active power involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1551 and 1875, over 1,300,000 African people were transported by force to the New World on ships flying the French flag, according to the Slave Voyages database. With these 4,118 crossings, France was responsible for 11% of the transatlantic slave trade, which in total affected more than 12.5 million men, women, and children from the beginning of the 16th century to the end of the 19th century. Two-thirds of those enslaved were men, and perhaps 27% were children. Approximately 13% perished during the Middle Passage, with their bodies being thrown into the sea. In 1658, on the initiative of Colbert, Louis XIV signed an edict establishing the legal status of slaves in the overseas French colonies. France was thus the first European kingdom to legislate on the status of slaves, producing the Code Noir, or Black Code. A slave's status was that of personal property. The living conditions in the colonies were extremely difficult. The life expectancy of slaves rarely exceeded 20 years on the plantations. For this reason, the colonists regularly bought new captives. In the 17th century, the majority of enslaved Africans were purchased in the Senegambia region, where the French established trading posts at Saint-Louis in Senegal and on the island of Gorée, as well as in the Bight of Benin. Wars and slave raids were common in Africa. African kings and chiefs put in place a system of hunters and traffickers. The captives were then exchanged for gunpowder, weapons, brandy, textiles, utensils, glass beads, and tobacco. But as the 17th century continued, the demand for captives grew. As a consequence, the African kingdoms found themselves in a quasi-permanent state of war. Customary practices turned sentences for criminal offenses into captivity, thus multiplying the number of captives. This trade led to veritable fortunes for the Europeans and African kings. By providing firearms amongst the trade goods, Europeans increased warfare and political instability in West Africa. Some states, such as Asante and Dahomey, grew powerful and wealthy as a result. Other states were completely destroyed, and their populations decimated, as they were absorbed by rivals. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, and towns and villages were depopulated. Many Africans were killed in slaving wars or remained enslaved in Africa. Many states, including Angola under Queen Nzinga Mbande and Congo, strongly resisted slavery. However, the interests of those involved in the trade proved too great to overcome. About two-thirds of the people sold to European traders were men. Fewer women were sold because their skills as farmers and craft workers were crucially important in African societies. The burden of rebuilding their violated communities fell to these women. While Nantes in France is known to be the home to some breathtaking churches and cathedrals, it once represented a dark chapter in the lives of Africans. Throughout the 18th century, Nantes maintained its rank as foremost port for the French slave trade, totaling 43% of the country's slaving expeditions. Slaves would be transported to Saint-Dominique, now Haiti, where they were put to work under the cruelest conditions. The death rate of slaves on the plantations required the enslaved workforce to be regularly replaced. The most sought-after captives were men 20 to 25 years, strong and in good health, to work on the sugar plantations. This was the most difficult work, which had a very high death rate for slaves and a short life expectancy. Adolescent slaves would be trained for roles vital to the functioning of the plantations, such as blacksmiths, wheelwrights, and locksmiths, and women would be trained for small repairs or domestic chores. Once they were accustomed to plantation life, some would become workshop slaves and be put in charge of the functioning of parts of the plantation infrastructure, such as the mill, the boiling house, and the curing house. Rest days were rare and could be canceled. Life in the colonies was particularly difficult for women. Masters would sometimes have non-consensual intercourse with their slaves. These defilements and forced concubinages resulted in children who were referred to at the time by the word mulatto, and whose status was set down in the Code Noir and depended on that of the mother. Anyone who tried to run away from the plantations was pursued by slave hunters, who were charged with either bringing them back to the plantation so they could be punished by mutilation, or with killing them. These escapes were known as maroonage. The life of a slave in the Antilles was one of work, punishment, malnutrition, and sickness.